You may or may not know that the topic for this evening is poetry and disproportion. And the disproportion as a topic rooted in a mortal desire for proportion and stability is so deeply entrenched in human argument, meaning here for the purposes of this discourse, ancient European and Middle Eastern argument, that in an odd way it becomes one of those timeless values that we propose to ourselves as stimuli for meditation and cogitation, however messy and unrewarding it may prove to be. Disproportion is embedded in the historical fables of Coriolanus and Timon of Athens, a statement which strongly implies that Shakespeare took the idea and the rhetoric of disproportion seriously, which, given what we know, is hardly surprising. Classical and Renaissance figures of rhetoric conceived of the formal construction of ideas of disorder as much as of ideas of order. Disproportion in the pre-Shakespearean fable of Coriolanus turns on two incompatible necessities: the necessities of war and the necessities of peace. The res publica at war needs and therefore honors and rewards the perfect human fighting machine. The war over, he is in embarrassment, and he himself, with nothing on which to exercise his sword arm and his tactical and strategic wits, falls into a murderous anarchy of spirit. This is the basic incompatibility. Shakespeare, of course, complicates his plot with other issues, especially class war and clashing personalities within Rome itself. Shakespeare's abstract sense of class war is not unlike that of the Tudor statesman and conservative theorist Sir Thomas Elyot, who in the book named The Governor argued angrily that when people used the term res publica, the commonweal, what they really meant was res plebea. Since one of the main functions of the developing purposes of Tudor drama is to complicate a mere pattern of types, such as would have appeared in the less inspired morality plays, Shakespeare works his way into the crowd, giving to them also ideas of value and idiomatic strengths of word and syntax with which to give such ideas utterance. In the latter part of my time at Boston University, Massachusetts, I developed a freshman seminar on the topic of Coriolanus. It ran for an entire semester and we met for an hour twice a week. The American teaching seminar is about 14 weeks. Beginning with the Greek historian rhetorician Dionysius of Halicarnassus and the Greco-Roman Plutarch of Chaeronea, the two chief classical sources of the Coriolanus fable, I took them through the Renaissance derivative histories, the French Amiot's translation of Plutarch, and Thomas North's translation of Amiot's French into English. People like to say that Shakespeare wrote Coriolanus with North's Plutarch open on the desk in front of him. I think that's the phrase, which as a convenient figure of speech may be accepted. We took something like 3 weeks over the play itself. We next asked why, judging by available evidence, the records of 17th century stagings of Coriolanus are so sparse. Jonathan Swift makes considerable use of the Coriolanus theme in his tractate a discourse of the contests and dissertation. Let it stand. Let it stand. Dissertations will do fine. What I'd actually written was dissensions. A discourse of the contests and dissensions between the nobles and the commons in Athens and Rome. An attack on the Tories in government under William III. His tract contains the definition of tyranny, which has a bearing on much that I find needful to say in this and subsequent lectures on poetry in relation and disrelation to the needs and demands of society. Let me quote briefly from him. Tyranny, by which is not meant the seizing of the uncontrolled or absolute power into the hands of a single person, but the breaking of the balance by whatever hand and leaving the power wholly in one scale. Let me give you that again. Tyranny, by which is not meant the seizing of the uncontrolled or absolute power into the hands of a single person, but the breaking of the balance by whatever hand and leaving the power wholly in one scale. Swift is so complex an ironist that it is always an exercise of one's intelligence to track him to the set of his unqualified opinion. And I, as you know, have a bad tendency to be an anthologist of bon mot. This caveat entered, though not necessarily accepted, the emphasis that I wish to make is, I trust, clear. I am giving it as my opinion, just my opinion, that running together with, yet apart from, a sense of tyranny as being either an over-aggrandized individual dictatorship or an absurdly and anarchically aggrandized populace, hoi polloi, the dregs of a democracy, to take a 17th century phrase, there is a further sense that the most debilitating tyranny is that of disproportion itself. What I needed to confide to members of my seminar, my freshman seminar, it might have been a PhD seminar in some other places, but it was a freshman seminar. What I needed to acquaint them with is that poetry and drama are ineluctably bound to the corpus politicum, and that while some poets and dramatists may well align and divide themselves along party lines, much that is among the best takes the form of an almost impartial keening over the seemingly perennial, seemingly innate and intractable subsistence of disproportion itself. For reasons that are ripe to speculate on, this sense of generalized lament is strong in late medieval and early Tudor authors, such as Gower, the Earl of Surrey and others, and subsequently it can be sensed strongly in Donne and Sidney and Fulke Greville, and with distinct shifts of gear, Dryden and Pope. But first let me say that I concluded my Boston seminar by looking at Bertolt Brecht's commentary on Shakespeare's Coriolanus, on Günter Grass's The Plebeians Rehearse the Uprising, which is a sort of dramatic footnote on Brecht's moral two-timing at the time of the East Berlin Uprising, and at Eliot's unfinished sequence, Coriolan. Eliot, as you know, said that his title came not from Shakespeare's play, but from Beethoven's overture. Notwithstanding his disclaimer, I read his two splendid sections that survive, Triumphal March and Difficulties of a Statesman, as belonging thoroughly and minutely to the classical Renaissance and post-Renaissance topoi of disequilibrium. Brecht worked towards a staging of his own translation of Shakespeare's Coriolanus in East Berlin in the early 1950s, and provides a necessary counterweight to the emphasis I've been placing on my self-projected topic of Threnos, lament, over what Robert Herrick termed time's transshifting. Okay, so that's my self-projected topic, Threnos, lament, over time's transshifting. There was in Renaissance literature a comedy of disproportion. In English, I would say, Thomas Nash, one of those contemporaries who, like Marlowe, frequently seemed to be racing neck and neck with Shakespeare, is our great comedian of disproportion. It is a major loss to our culture that Nash is not more known, appreciated, allowed to exist in equity with our own comedians. And in a number of ways, Brecht's Coriolanus notes are what Nash's Coriolanus, which, need I say, never materialized, might have been, had it been possible for Nash to have done some idiosyncratic, savagely anti-Marxist, anti-Calvinist interpretation of dialectic during his period of study at Cambridge's seat of learned Calvinism, St. John's College. Well, if you could make sense of that sentence, you're better than I am. Let me just try to make sure we don't misunderstand one another on two essential points. Nash never wrote anything called Coriolanus. Okay, and as far as I can tell, never contemplated it. Well, how can you tell? I don't know. As far as I can tell, he didn't. And of course, Thomas Nash, a contemporary of Shakespeare, did not study Karl Marx. I mean, I've got to clear the air at least to that extent. Brecht too sees something radically invigorating in disproportion, because significantly, though with him not wholly, the class struggle both resists and utilizes the disequilibrium inherent in anarchical plutocracy. I thought he'd get round to that again. Yes, that phrase of William Morris that I frequently resort to, as you will have noticed. And as the B figure, Brecht himself, in the published rehearsal dialogue says, we don't have to do the play if we don't enjoy it. We don't have to do the play if we don't enjoy it. Now, I realize that in my dealings with you on the subject of English poetry, I may give the impression that I don't overmuch enjoy it. So I'm here trying to iron a kink out of my reputation with Brecht's assistance. We should also note the character B's words, the conclusion of the rehearsal discussion in the printed version that we have. Even with popular ballads, so B. Brecht says, even with popular ballads, or the peep shows at fairs, the simple people who are so far from simple, love stories of the rise and fall of great men, of eternal change, of the ingenuity of the oppressed. Do bear that in mind for subsequent lectures, of the ingenuity of the oppressed. How much of literature is in that little phrase, the ingenuity of the oppressed, of the potentialities of mankind, and they hunt for the truth that is, open quotes, behind it all, end quotes. So from Brecht's viewpoint, there is something very exhilarating in all this turmoil and conflict. And I should say that he has rooted out for us qualities that are preeminently present in Shakespeare's play itself, that ethical overviews, such as the one I am presenting, tend to underplay unintentionally for the most part. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that we must not speak of the theme of a play or a poem or a novel as simply the synopsis. It is also the syntactic, the semantic, and the rhythmic. And Shakespeare ultimately stands preeminent in our tradition, albeit given a close run by such geniuses among his contemporaries as Marlowe, Thomas Nash, and the translators of the Geneva Bible, because he finally has the edge over the others in the release, counterpointing, jarring, or reconciling of these several forces. There is a Mad Meg element in Shakespeare's theatre and also in Brecht's. Mad Meg, a Mad Meg element. I'm here referring to a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, De la Grite, which more than one 20th century artist or theorist found compelling, though not one seems to agree with another as to the artist's intention in creating her. Brecht was powerfully drawn to Peter Bruegel, which isn't at all astonishing, and one may well see the effect of Bruegel's work generally, not only on the theme, but also the visual masterstroke of Mother Courage, that photo still that everyone knows of the handcart pulled by her two sons, Mother Courage, played by Helena Weigel, seated in it. One of the best 20th century English critics writing on Shakespeare and Tudor drama was A.P. Rossiter, now almost completely forgotten, as in our 5-year plan culture, everything of merit is, together, of course, with everything that is trash. But for everything of merit to go down the pipe with everything of trash is not justice. It's a kind of anarchy. Two of the essays in Rossiter's book, the book's called Angel with Horns, 1961, the title essay on Richard III, and the third essay, Ambivalence, the Dialectic of the Histories, should be required reading for alert students of Shakespeare. A.P. Rossiter, Angel with Horns, 1961. I allude to him, though his value quite transcends the value of my reference, because he too approached Shakespeare with an eye developed by an awareness of Bruegel's paintings. In a footnote to the Ambivalence essay, Rossiter says, Shakespeare wrote in an unstable equilibrium between a world or universe of thought, of faith in God-ordainedness, and another world, the inverted world of belief only in power. And he goes on, the inverted world symbol is familiar in Bruegel's pictures. De la Grite, Mad Meg, is the subject of an essay by the British painter Leonard Rosaman in a series called Painters on Painting, published in London by Cassell in the 1960s. The Rosaman text is 1969. As part of his visual analysis of the painting, he says of Meg, the head is thrust forward, the toothless mouth open, and there is a mad stare in the left eye, looking straight ahead at nothing. The head is thrust forward, the toothless mouth open, and there is a mad stare in the left eye, looking straight ahead at nothing. I would be very much happier about the condition of poetry in English in the first and second decades of this century if I could look at a poem or a book of poems by one or more contemporaries and say of it or them, the head is thrust forward, the toothless mouth open, and there is a mad stare in the left eye looking straight ahead at nothing. There needs to be, it's not, it doesn't cover all contingencies, let us say. But there needs to be, I would hazard, more especially at the present time, a dulla grit element in any work that attracts concentrated attention. And I very much regret that the role of Mad Meg seems to have devolved upon me in my thrice yearly appearances on this platform. Among the current wave of stand-up comedians and rap musicians, there may be someone capable of taking on the role of Mad Meg. Or much better, let us say, Tom Nash, the Nash of Lenten stuff. Have with you to Saffron Walden. There's a title. Have with you to Saffron Walden. Or Piers Penniless, his supplication to the devil. And as I regularly say when backing out of a cul-de-sac of my own making, I shall watch developments there with keen interest. No, I won't, not really. Nonetheless, as I have readily enough conceded on numerous occasions, the kind of emphasis I regularly impose omit characteristics and attributes of poetry as significant as any to which I am more inclined to draw attention. An awareness of the endemic nature of disproportion is, as I've observed, among the root observations of mankind. The Hebrew teachers of wisdom and righteousness, like Koheleth and Ben Sirach, as much as the Greek post-Platonists and post-Aristotelians, and the moralist rhetoricians Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Plutarch of Chaeronea. Be not excessively righteous, neither make thyself overwise. Be not excessively wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldst thou die before thy time? Ecclesiastes, or the preacher, who I rather suspect is adopting a mask and moreover laughing at us. It is the accumulating evidence of disproportion that in the history of European and Middle Eastern theology and philosophy gives rise to the doctrine of equity and a variety of symbols and emblems relating to the golden mean. A grasp of the concept of equity is essential to our understanding of the Tudor poetry and prose, particularly the writings of the English Jesuits, Edmund Campion and Robert Southwell, who made felicitous play with that term, equity. But even as early as the late 11th century, in the Bologna Law School, equity had been defined as the mere enunciation of a principle of justice. And it is the hovering presence of this mere, as in mere enunciation, that gives a particular poignancy to the balanced phrases, the grammatical courtesies of Campion's and Southwell's prose and of Southwell's poems. Mere enunciation exists only as a steely wisp of graciousness in the presence of the rack, and both Campion and Southwell were savagely tortured before being subjected to the monstrous rites of Tyburn. Dulla Grit was there all right, as a mad woman with fixated stare pushing her way from the back of the crowd to the foot of the scaffold. Though whether as a grief-crazed Catholic fighting to dip her handkerchief in a martyr's blood, or as some sadistic fishwife there for the fun of it, I cannot say. In any case, what concerns us is the knowledge required to distinguish between distinct kinds of energy in our study of Henrician, Edwardian, Marian, and Elizabethan phases of our English 16th century poetry and prose. Why is Southwell's prose in an epistle of comfort and an humble supplication to Her Majesty different from Nash's Piers Penniless, his supplication to the devil? And why are they, in their crucially different ways, so very good? When I say we need dulagrit, what I mean essentially is that we could now do with an artist possessed of the virtues of Peter Bruegel the Elder, and of course, as I'm trying to indicate fairly to you, it's a counsel of desperation, for which I have to take personal responsibility. I mean, it isn't entirely balanced. But there it is. I've no doubt that Damien Hirst has heard of Peter Bruegel the Elder. He may believe that he is improving Peter Bruegel for our times. In fact, I would say that in the greater overarching reality, Hirst's diamond-studded skull is a minute object in a remote corner of Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. That, I believe, will be its true place in the long history of European graphic art and of cultural pathology. I would further concede that in making the argumentative capital that I do out of the concept of disproportion, I neglect vital matters to which, as a recent example, Brian Stock draws our attention in a number of able books. The author's name is Brian Stock, and I refer here to two themes discussed in Stock's book, Ethics Through Literature, Ascetic and Aesthetic Reading in Western Culture, Hanover, Massachusetts, 2007, pages 93 to 95. One, that aesthetic reading in an ethical context is a real activity of the human mind. And two, the proposition that reading and reflecting on literary texts can contribute to the ancient quest for happiness, eudaimonia. If someone were to exclaim that in everything that I have said or written over 60 years, there is not a single indication that I believe eudaimonia exists, let alone that it should be introduced in a discussion of poetry, I would say that I've been misunderstood, but that I can understand how such a misunderstanding has come about. And I haven't the faintest recollection what I said in that last sentence. Did I say I misunderstand or can misunderstand? Let me, for the sake of my world auditors, make sure that that sentence came out all right. I would say that I've been misunderstood, but that I can understand how such a misunderstanding has come about. Why do I write sentences like that? The emphasis I tend to persist with, because I take original sin as a given, is Pauline, Augustinian, Lutheran, and in a 20th century sense, Barthian. The causes and effects to which I agree more attention might well be paid in my lectures and tirades is essentially Horatian. The Horatian strain can be bogusly Christianized by confusing the curiosa felicitas of Horatian technical accomplishment with the felicity of heavenly bliss enjoyed by saints and martyrs. To the best of my knowledge of Chaucerian import, felicity was used of earthly happiness. It was in the Bible, certainly by 1557, where the Geneva New Testament uses it for a phrase in Galatians 4:15. But when I looked up the corresponding place in Tyndale's 1526 New Testament, instead of felicity we have happy. And in the Wycliffite Bible of 1380, instead of felicity we have blessing. In the Great Bible of 1539, felicity is certainly there, but I can't say whether that is the first time the word felicity comes into the English scripture translations. Felicity is used very splendidly in Sonnet 68 of Edmund Spenser's Amoretti sequence, a sequence which I otherwise find inferior to Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, as well as to Shakespeare's 1609 collection. In English 16th century writing, in respect of felicity, we reach a fertile plateau where the sense of curiosa felicitas, the fine turning of a verse, works in the closest conjunction with a lofty ethical projection based on the new Calvinism, and with a grasp of the nature of disproportion as sinfulness. I allude, of course, to Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, written most likely between 1579 and 1585, published 1595. There is disproportion in Sidney, but it occurs for him in history, because history deals in images of true matters, such as indeed were done. In an effective sense, history is amoral, as I would say, rather than immoral, as Sidney says, being captive to the truth of a foolish world. Sidney insists that it is immoral, being many times a terror from well-doing and an encouragement to unbridled wickedness. See we not virtuous Cato driven to kill himself, and rebel Caesar so advanced that his name yet, after 1600 years, lasteth in the highest honour? But at the other extreme, Sidney asserts, when, for example, Menenius Agrippa, and here Sidney makes his own act of homage to the classical Coriolanus fable, when Menenius Agrippa uses his exemplum of the belly versus the mutinous body parts to make the Roman plebs act in harmony with the Roman Senate, or when the prophet Nathan relates to David the fable of the poor man's stolen lamb to make David as in a glass to see his own filthiness, Menenius Agrippa and Nathan the prophet are working as poets work. These alleged attributes of poetry go back as far as Aristotle, and according to Sidney are the attributes of the highest achievements in poetry, the Psalms, which Sidney Englished, together with his sister the Countess of Pembroke, into a great variety of metrics and verse patterns. And Dante, too, who held, according to Sidney, Dante held heaven and hell under the authority of his pen. This is what Sidney says of Dante. He held heaven and hell under the authority of his pen. Now, this is a very long way from my Dulla Greek fixation, and you will not be surprised when I confess that there's always been a shade of unease in my appreciation of the eloquent beauty of Sidney's style of definitions. Notwithstanding that unease, I was keen to allow the phrase "under the authority of his pen" into the armoury of the true or real poet, as distinct from the charlatan, the mountebank, the poetaster. Now, one of the two profound and acute friends to whom I submit my argument once more saved me from myself. I was desirous of saying that whereas the poetaster is devoured ultimately by the truth of a foolish world, the poet, the true poet, is one who establishes moral authority by the power of techne. That is to say, I would have made Sidney a contemporary of Ezra Pound's, who wrote, "All values ultimately come from our judicial sentences." All values ultimately come from our judicial sentences, says Ezra. But my friend reminded me that I had myself argued in print 28 years ago that against the evidence of history, no sentence of any poet, however magisterial, can be said to establish its verdictive. Poetry is not a legal system, and equity to which sentimentalists such as myself, steeped in Elizabethan recusant texts, recurrently make appeal, is a thoroughly elusive term. I'm working my way around, I hope, to finding illustrations for Professor Stock's proposal of recognition of the meditative process he terms aesthetic reading in an ethical context. And my friend also said, look, you've got to make it absolutely clear to them that although your lecture's entitled Poetry and Disproportion, you're now moving on to talk about poetry and proportion. And I said, well, I think I made that fairly clear in the opening, but you know, I always take your advice. And yes, I will emphasize that my argument about poetry and disproportion moves eventually into talking about poetry and proportion. And this is, the Meccano bits are clanking their way towards that epiphany. Aesthetic reading in an ethical context may have grown from a study of the various English translations of the Consolations of Philosophy of Boethius, conceived as passages of meditative prose, alternating with passages of verse. Chaucer made one of these translations, though astonishingly, as it will seem to us, as he was a great Boethian poet, he turned all Boethius's metrics into prose paraphrase. One can sense a connection between the work on Boethius and a short, powerful lyric poem by Chaucer in the bonum concilium, bon conseil, good counsel mode that was not uncommon when Chaucer wrote his lyric of 3 stanzas plus an envoy or coda. Each stanza, including the coda, consists of 7 pentameter lines rhyming A, B, A, B, B, C, C, and all the A, B, and C rhymes retain the same vowel patterns throughout the poem, so that in a 28-line poem there are only 3 rhymes. It is sometimes called truth, sometimes ballade de bon conseil, and sometimes both. Flee for the press, and dwell with soothfastness. Suffice thine own thing, though it be small. For hoard hath hate, and climbing tickleness. Press hath envy, and will blent over all. Savour no more than thee behover shall. Rule well thyself, that other folk canst read, and truth shall deliver, it is no dread. To paraphrase, leaving out... Can you still hear me? Yeah, leaving out scholarly disputes about certain words. Paraphrase, avoid the crowd and keep close to true and truthful living. Be content with what you have, though it is little. Hatred is propagated by inequitable wealth, and advancement is apt to take a fall. Praise consorts with envy, and plenteous fortune blinds you to eventualities. Have a relish for no more than it may behove you to have. You who can direct others, see to it that you govern yourself, and truth shall make you free. No fear of that. Flee for the press and dwell with sophassness. Suffice thine own thing, though it be small, for hoard hath hate and climbing tickleness, press hath envy, and well blent over all. Savour no more than thee behoveth shall, rule well thyself that other folk canst read, and truth shall deliver, it is no dread. Chaucer is writing something you may well say that is wholly beautiful and wholly commonplace and wholly predictable. And you will say, how have you, who in 2 previous lectures have gone overboard for inventiveness? Don't you remember that in last term's lecture you called for a black swan to astonish us? How, having praised inventiveness like that, can you present us for our admiration this verse of commonplaces? To which I answer, we could not have predicted this particular special ordinariness until Chaucer invented it for us. To derive so much from Boethius, from probably the Jewish wisdom teachers, from the Gospels, and to confide it to the reader in this way is an art of supreme concision and tact. It is no dread, no fear of that. To confide the meaning as Chaucer confides it with his lovely economy of phrase is to create a sense of intimate reciprocity. And note that the burden of what the poem contemplates in our presence understood, is disorder, hatred, envy, discrepancy, the repetitive catastrophes of fortune and of fortune's wheel. As I noted earlier, and I'm trying to keep this thread running through the lecture, as I noted earlier, from earliest classical times, it was the understanding of the inevitability of natural and social chaos that drove thinkers to contemplate and evoke the idea of equity and the golden mean. Chaucer's lovely poem is written in praise of mediocrity, and the entire sense range of that word, the golden mediocrity that Bacon would praise nearly 2 centuries later, the whole sense range of that word as it stood in the minds of our thinking ancestors has been turned on its head by the attitude to mediocrity that now prevails. Mediocrity is no longer a golden mean, a golden mediocrity. And we must understand that switch before we come to judgment on medieval and early Renaissance poems that appear to us mediocre. One of the most remarkable poems to have been written during the Henrician period, indeed during the entire 16th century in England, the Elegy written by Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, for Sir Thomas Wyatt, belongs to this particular Chaucerian line of golden mean, and in turn anticipates a number of emphases later found in Sidney's Apology. The Chaucer, the Surrey, the Sidney are variants of Bonum Concilium, though Sidney's argument is made more complex, or at least multifaceted, by a sense of what I call Elizabethan psychology, insights into quirks of psyche, such as you find in Thomas Nash and in Shakespeare. Here are 2 or 3 stanzas of Surrey on Wyatt. A visage stern and mild, where both did grow vice to contemn, in virtue to rejoice. Amid great storms, whom grace assured so, to live upright and smile at fortune's choice. A hand that taught what might be said in rhyme, that reft Chaucer the glory of his wit, a mark the which, unparfited for time, some may approach, but never none shall hit. A tongue that served in foreign realms his king, whose courteous talk to virtue did inflame each noble heart, a worthy guide to bring our English youth by travail unto fame. Quatrains 3 to 5 of a 9-quatrain poem plus a final couplet. Surrey, writing perhaps shortly after Wyatt's death in 1542, he himself was put to death in 1547, places him directly in the Chaucerian bonum concilium line. He even says that Wyatt has stolen Chaucer's glory, that reft Chaucer the glory of his wit, which is pushing it, but is an understandable hyperbole in the context of Henrician art polity. To live upright and smile at fortune's choice, again a statement from deep within an ethical tradition that is simultaneously Horatian, the man of life upright, and Boethian. In an attempt to redeem a lewdness of our time, I dare to call the poem an outstanding early example of national treasure eulogy. Wyatt is a worthy guide to bring our English youth by travail unto fame. It would be difficult to overstress the breach that this poem makes in the adamantine wall of Tudor hegemonic etiquette. Wyatt, a scion of Kentish minor gentry, was in effect a commoner. Surrey represented the highest nobility in the kingdom. He died in 1547 because the anarchic King Henry, on his deathbed, believed the Earl to be thrusting his way into the royal succession. It was unthinkable until Surrey did so that someone of such eminence should stoop to honour one so mean. When you correctly point out that 3 of Henry's 6 wives, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr, were strictly speaking commoners, and that one of his chancellors, Thomas More, was a commoner, and the 2 more, Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, were from what some would have termed base stock. My response is that of Mandy Rice Davis during the Profumo scandal. Well, he would, wouldn't he? Henry was a political oxymoron, at once the autocratic creator of a hegemony and the anarchic destroyer of a hierarchy. One of the few things that elephantine farce, the Tudors, got nearly right was the murderous hatred felt by the remnants of the Plantagenet pre-Bosworth nobility for the Ciceronian new men in the royal administration. It should be also noted that at a time when etiquette required noblemen and gentlemen to circulate their poems in manuscript around a small circle of privileged readers, aesthetic reading in an ethical or unethical context, Surrey's poem was actually printed, part of an 8-page booklet. I here cite Emrys Jones, called An Excellent Epitaph of Sir Thomas Wyatt. And the booklet contained 2 sonnets, also in honour of Wyatt. I come back again, having cited two poems, one by Chaucer, one by Henry Howard Earl of Surrey, which praise a kind of excellent conformity, which praise a kind of superior form of golden mean. I come back to ask myself the same old question: why have I got this fixation on Dulle Griet? Why am I going after all the time this mad meg element in creative potentiality that fascinates me and that strikes me with joy and fear? Note that I say creative potentiality, not creative power. A creative power will manifest itself in one way or another as the ability to restrain, to contain, to deliver in whatever masterly way the flux and density of the materia poetica. For the real poet, and here I include the real minor poet, for the real poet, raw potentiality, a language in the raw, always has its head thrust forward, the toothless mouth open, and a mad stare in the left eye looking straight ahead at nothing. And every finely ordered and structured artifact is, if not explicitly then tacitly, a recognition that disorder and disproportion are real and ever present, and that we have in ourselves the continual tug of anarchy to which we succumb, and which may produce formidable artistic effects in itself, or against which we build edifices of threatened symmetry. Shakespeare in the sonnets called that disruptive force will. As I begin to draw this discussion to a close, one thread remains to be taken up. I admit to being focused on music to an intense degree, playing many and varied CDs from Regina Caeli to Rehab. That's there for the alliteration. No, it's not. It's a very, very fine song. And reading a wide variety of liner notes. It would be a contemptibly cheap remark to say that the notes are sometimes more interesting than the music they introduce, but I shall say it nonetheless. In the notes to her performance of Bach's magnificent early toccatas, Angela Hewitt quotes from the Musurgia Universalis of 1650, written by Athanasius Kircher, and she quotes at the point where he describes what he calls stilus fantasticus. The fantastic style is suitable for instruments. It is the most free and unrestrained method for composing. It is bound to nothing, neither to words nor to a melodic subject. It was instituted to display genius and to teach the hidden design of harmony and the ingenious composition of harmonic phrases and fugues. In calling the style free and unrestrained, I think that Kircher means restrained by nothing but its own musical logic, as in counterpoint. That is, not subservient to sacred or secular texts, to liturgical or secular programs dictated by anyone or anything other than the composer's own delight in displaying his inventive genius. Poetry must always differ from music, because it always bears with itself the conceptual and associational nature of language. This being said, there are certain poems which, like the music conceived of by Kircher, gives the impression of existing purely for the sake of its own euphony. In An Apology for Poetry, Sidney declares of the poet, as he could not of the philosopher or the historian, "He cometh to you with words set in delightful proportion, either accompanied with or prepared for the well-enchanting skill of music. And music he elsewhere terms the most divine striker of the senses." What a wonderful description of music, the most divine striker of the senses. And I must highlight for you one word in my first passage from Sydney, with words set in delightful proportion, in an essay which began, in a lecture which began with the theme of poetry and disproportion, and went on to say that proportion, a love of proportion, grows from the human distress at the ineluctable and innate disproportion in life. I now come towards a close in praise of certain poems of proportion. Don't worry, certain poems. Read a bit of one poem. There is in late Elizabethan, early Jacobean English a style of poetry quite distinct from the good counsel style that Wyatt, I think, inherited from such predecessors as Chaucer's Truths. One of the places to look for the eudaimonic is, oddly enough, you would say, in poetic treatises. I may overrun by about 5 minutes, I hope that's all right. Rose-cheeked Laura, come, sing thou smoothly with thy beauty's silent music, either others sweetly gracing. Lovely forms do flow from consent divinely framed. Heaven is music, and thy beauty's birth is heavenly. These dull notes we sing, discords need for helps to grace them. Only beauty, purely loving, knows no discord, but still moves delight, like clear springs renewed by flowing, ever perfect, ever in themselves eternal. That lovely cadence, which must be one of the loveliest cadences in all English poetry, is achieved by breaking the word themselves across the line. Ever perfect, ever in themselves eternal. This lovely tribute to Eudaimonia comes from a treatise on rhyme and metrics, Thomas Campion's Observations in the Art of English Poesy, 1602. And like other poems in the treatise, owes its life to theorizing as to whether unrhymed lyrics are superior to rhymed. Rose-cheeked Laura is unrhymed verse, and whether English verse, which is measured accentually, can ever rightly be tamed by the rules of Latin verse, which is quantitative. Disproportion, you see, in Campion's treatise. Don't confuse Thomas Campion with Edmund Campion, the Jesuit martyr. They're two entirely different people. Campion's treatise is really saying that disproportion exists as a hypothetical factor, which is, are English metrics compared to Latin metrics uncouth, which the specially composed, exquisite English lyric is there in our presence to reject. And I think that it's in a poem such as Rose-cheeked Laura that in a very narrow yet exquisite lyric form, English poetry comes closest to the musical practice termed by Athanasius Kircher stilus fantasticus, and comes nearest to being the pure evocation of proportion, which throughout this lecture I have been saying is always held on a most perilous knife edge of achievement against disproportion. Now, the final disproportionate element you have to encounter this evening is the ambiguity in my philosophical and critical standpoint. Those who detect in me a radical profession cannot be sure whether the radicalism implies tearing up by the roots or rediscovering the roots and carefully nurturing them. I should say that it is my narcissist belief that my critical and philosophical approach works according to both methods. I've described myself in another place as a Ruskinian Tory, adding that it is only a Ruskinian Tory these days who can be mistaken for an old-fashioned Marxist. My main criticism of William Morris is that he was an over-ambitious and underachieving poet, which is a marginal criticism in truth, considering the immediate power and effectiveness of the central body of his work, the essays and lectures on the nature of exploitation, both good in that we could be said to exploit the durability and malleability of metals to produce works of utility and of beauty, and evil in the exploitation of humanity and of fair rates of exchange. It is a polity not without its own perils. The fascist Ezra Pound, whose poetry I had better tell you here and now is among the greatest produced last century, so that the hold in a rather dreadful conjunction, the fact that some of the greatest poetry of last century was written by a man who was wickedly fascist in his beliefs, is a responsibility that one does not undertake lightly. In some future lecture I would like to give more time to that question. William Morris, and I am about on the last paragraph now. William Morris, as you know from my two previous lectures, gave me the phrase that I shall have to struggle with not to use more than once a year. It comes from the great lecture, Art Under Plutocracy, delivered on November the 14th, 1883, not 100 yards from where we are now assembled, next door up at University College. John Ruskin in the chair. John Ruskin in the chair. I've many reservations about this place, particularly its self-sustaining ability to exploit itself. But when I read that, John Ruskin in the chair for a lecture, Art Under Plutocracy, in which Morris coined that phrase, which for me is one of the central moral critical phrases of the last 100 and more years. Anarchical plutocracy. A kind of shiver goes through me, as though my inmost spirit were experiencing a shock of recognition. And I acknowledge that there is something here, even now, sort of caught up into the history of this place, that gives centrality to the marginalized, that allows someone such as myself to come in for 3 hours each academic year from my own margins, and allows me to focus on the eccentricities of English poetry and to proclaim them as, in my certifiable opinion, things of essential central value in the alienated and alienating doings of the day. Thank you.